Welcome to the Universal Principles chapter. In this chapter, we are going to talk about the universal principles that stand at the roots of almost every culture and are used multi-level. One of these levels for our field of reference is architecture, and then the transformation of the scenery through a set of changes that man has done, also in the interpretation of these principles. First, we can observe that the principles derive from realities of the inner nature. As we can see in this picture, the galaxy starts from a focus and expands itself in a spiral-shaped way inside the cosmos. This refers to the fact that nature has always a start from the center, which develops itself in a radial way. We can find this center feeling within various fields and architectonic typologies in several cultures. During my travels from a continent to another, I realized that man has a pulsing heart and in some way feels nature principles in the same manner everywhere. Later, the interpretation of these principles develops in different ways. For example, the beat and upbeat of the pulsing heart is linked to a principle which ties to nature as a perpetual transformation from full to empty, from expansion to contraction. So this feeling, which is linked to this center archetype that stands inside man, is passed on within and confined spaces created by his own. Inside nature stands the center principle which begins and from which all the rest is manifested. In this second picture, we are in a small town, Palombara Sabina, in Lazio. It is curious to see how the radial disposition of this small town demonstrates this principal concept that is just enunciated, as to say that its reality is visualized by man from the center of the town to its periphery. In this case, in urban transformation, we can find a church and the city hall inside the nucleus that later has developed itself in the following urban configuration of the small town. Of course, we find this principle in several cultures. In the middle of American Indian villages, we find the totem, or the holiest and the most important representation. An interesting thing that makes us curious is that the town is not equal in its parts. The center characterizes a larger relevance, a feeling of bigger importance that man gives to this area. Going on about the center, we can see the second picture of the Borobudur temple in Java, which represents the Buddhist vision of cosmos, three cosmic levels represented by many passages given by the steps that underscore evolution levels. In the temple there are different small chortens around the big central chorten that portray the wheel to represent the cosmic principles linked to the center. What we begin to observe, besides the fact to see number 3 developing itself in his interior, motif that is repeatedly used by different cultures and religions as Trimurti or Christian Trinity, is that the religious belief, Buddhist in this case, which determines 3 ascension levels, mold the architecture in a specific way. The interesting thing is that from this center we begin to catch a glimpse of the 4 lines. These 4 lines stand where the steps go down, and these are situated in the 4 cardinal directions. For this, furthermore, the center, there are cardinal directions too. Also, temples' portals were very often oriented in these 4 directions, north, south, east and west. Let's take care about these important concepts. Rather now, watching this picture, it is curious to observe that we keep on rolling around Earth. If we might take this picture with a long shutter speed and an open diaphragm, we would see stars spinning in this way. The center of these stars is oriented more or less to the polar star, but in the reality this center is moving to Vega, event due to the movement of the Earth axis, called equinoxis precession, one of the Earth revolutions. By the way, what is interesting is that we keep on moving unwittingly to a center. In these studies, we have to always think about the long period effects that are impossible to see in the short period, but that have an effective importance in the long period. We can say that in the long period on Earth, there is a perpetual centrifugal and centripetal force that works both in the cells and in the space in which we live. So we can say that center is something we live in an innate way. As a matter of fact, also the electron that rotates around the nucleus represents these two forces that express physical and gravitational forces, and the other forces and rules described by modern physics. The interesting thing is that these forces continually involve us and enter in a symbolic representation weave that we suffer and live on. During my travels, for example in India, I saw how temples could be mostly structured in this way. We find the gopurams, which are the portals that pre-announce temple enter, positioned in the four cardinal directions, and that slowly descend to the center of the temple. This temple is in Tamil Nadu and is named Sri Ramgam. It is a very well-known temple, and visiting it can be very interesting. From the outside, gopurams show a set of symbols and holy proportion for Indian language. In our Occidental world, we have proportions that are based on the holy cube or golden proportions. Here instead, we have more kinds of proportions whom are linked to the relation with human body, and a set of knowledge that we will observe later. As we were talking about, the interesting thing is that these portals keep on decreasing to the center. This for the reason that pilgrims have to feel the sensation that more we go closer to the center, the deeper side of reality, more this reality becomes immanent, not visible and not striking. So the non-visible thing concept is represented in a special, symbolic and planning way. Inside the nucleus we find a small temple in which stands the divinity Vishnu. As Occidental man, I could not enter in this small temple. By the way, I took this picture from outside, which represents what I would have seen inside. It is interesting to observe the 5 heads of the snake, where odd numbers are used. This fact is common in several cultures. Odd numbers are often charged, stronger, with a more dynamic effect within the planning than even number. It is also interesting to delve into this subject because in Chinese culture too, odd numbers are masculine and even numbers are feminine. This polarity stands just to characterize odd numbers with a more dynamic quality. You can also imagine how 2 columns create a static dynamism. 3 columns create a spiral-shaped evolution within the thin space. Spiral is already a transformation, evolution, and movement element. It is well known how odd numbers as 3, 5, 7, and 9 were used in several cultures as holy numbers that have symbolic effects of transformation and evolution, in reverse of even numbers that determine a certain steadiness. Let's continue to develop this center concept, and let's see, for example, columns. Here we are in another temple in India. Indian poorness strikes us in this kind of travels, and it is the thing that most remains in memory. India not only is a land to visit, but to feel. It is a land that entered deep in the heart. Looking the column, I observed how this has always been the representation of the union between two big hemispheres, heaven and earth. Remember, for example, that Doric and Corinth columns already showed in its stable square basement and in its floral capital wheel, just to call to mind the tree symbol. The tree that in some way is the symbol of the man of life, which takes nourishment from earth, that is the rudest aspects of existence, then to feed itself and raise to the tiniest and most spiritual aspects. Man, as the tree, stands in the middle of these two forces. This is the triad theme: sky, man, and earth, used by several cultures. In this context, we find it resumed in the column motif, which represents the axis of these two forces. Inside the living space, a column can be valued as a totem column, which unifies these two realities. In architecture, often we find out planning in which columns, essential at a static level, are disturbing the good fluidity of the space. In regard of this, we could make disappear the column inside furnished systems, so to make it invisible, or before we can also think to value it, giving it all its symbolic meaning. Chinese people often are used to mirror or to cover the columns to make them disappear, for the reason that sometimes they generate a qi, as to say, a not so positive thing energy. It is important to feel that the column has a static pressure aspect, which we could compare with an energetic pressure. This is an important concept that we will develop later. In another travel I've made at the slopes of Tibet, in Ladakh, in a Gompa, as to say a monastery in Lamayuru, I observed the ritual that monks were doing, as to say were drawing with colored dusts, a mandala. What fascinated me is the fact that after the opening ritual, monks began to draw, starting from the center of the drawing and developing the rest of the mandala in the four directions. This ritual takes several days. At the end of it, the mandala is admired and then erased, blowing on it, to leave the immanent life sense that is a passage. This ritual touched deeply the monks whom draw on to take trouble in their inner path. For this, also in the symbolic representations, the center concept is felt. The same principle is found out in the Indian culture too. In fact, the ancient Indian knowledge, called Vastu, has a lot of links with the Chinese Feng Shui, probably just for the fact that both these knowledges are inside the same Oriental area that has created several influences of cultures. In this mandala, we find out the representation of the powers oriented in the space and in the various cardinal directions. For the moment, I will not spell things out, but what I just want to show you is that, in the center, there is a vacuum, and this vacuum represents the Brahmasi, which is the Hinduist divinity par excellence, which is represented in the center of this energetic structure. Please notice this kind of being pressed on the ground. It is called Vastupurusha. In the Indian mythology, it represents the breaking up cosmic energy, which is stopped by through divinity power that push it on the ground in several directions as to create order from chaos and the manifestation of infinite forms. This power of the manifestation of a place, the genius loci, or spirit of the place, expresses itself through different energetic polarities. It is very interesting to observe that in the center of the mandala stands Brahma, which is represented with an empty part. This means that in the center of a structure you do not have to build, because the center has to be fluid and has to allow the interconnection with all the other ambients. This is an Indian house that I photographed. We can notice this overture to the center in an octagonal shape. We do not go so far away if we observe the ancient Chinese houses, because these had an overture in the middle too, as Roman houses that had an overture in the middle for the water collection, called the impluvium, and so on in many traditional cultures of the world. This makes us perceive that man often is linked with other beings on earth for the reasons that human race belongs to a kind of unity. So some perceptions or feelings are in same ways passed on to an unconscious level in every living being. A sentence which I often say is, if you have a good idea, be sure that someone else is having the same idea at the same moment. This for the reason that we are all linked between us. So we can deduce that evolution factor is a synchronic factor inside all the field of transformation that human being lives. The center is, for this, an element of the space that is felt in more levels, and if we start discovering the reason of this reality, we observe that it is connected more with the inner nature than the exterior nature. This picture represents another travel I have done in Europe. It is the Frogner Park in Oslo, Norway. Here we find a set of structures that represent man life. It is interesting to observe, once again, how in the center we find this ensemble of tangle of bodies, this human totem. Buddha representation that I filmed in the Berlin Museum. You would ask, what is the link between this picture and the previous speech? This want to be a cue to think about how human being is done. We do not have just one cerebral center. Let's start to think about this representation with more depth. At the first symbolic level, the large belly represents the root concept, presence and center position that Buddha reached during his inner path. Belly represents also fertility and prosperity, and this concept is represented by other old small rounded forms too. A second level of analysis could be the way to represent the diaphragm capacity obtained by Buddha, the representation of his depth breath. In my yoga experiences and other kinds of training, I understood how a deep abdominal breathing brings a deep diaphragm relaxed too. More the breathing is large and depth, more we obtain a dilatation and the organs pushing ability, just to allow us the maximum oxygenation. In martial arts, this is very used to allow a load of chi, as to say the thing energy, and then to manifest it in different modalities as defense, attack, or cure. In the navel zone, precisely an inch below, we find the expression zone of power and vitality of the human body. This point is called Tan Tien in several martial arts, in Chinese and Japanese language. This part of the body is considered the nerve center of man energy, the center of his stability and his power. A good development of this center determines good health and the presence ability of man. It is interesting to see how last medical researches discovered that inside the intestine there are cells which seems to neuronal cells, so in some way it seems that would be a second brain at the belly level. In old Chinese knowledge, brain was the outlet of a river, which started from its roots through the vertebral column, called holy bone because from there begins and is represented life. In reality, our emotions are represented in every cell of our body. Body, mind, and spirit are all interconnected with matter in every level of our body. Our body is something that is linked not only by an existence level. However, living beings have got a center which often is also the most relevant power center. It is interesting to see also how in Occidental fashion center is considered in a different way. For example, in traditional fashion, the man who has a tight pelvis and large shoulders is considered charming. In reality, long ago, was the reverse. A man who has a big presence and stability was considered charming, insofar he gave safeness and allowed prosperity. This center of mass inversion in our culture and fashion shows us how we are not seeing man in his original character. We could say the same thing for feminine fashion. Models are represented every time thinner and less prosperous. This fact underlines a lack of vision of what is natural and nice. We have always to consider that body mass acquire and deposit itself in relation with love, as so in relation with the attentions that a human being received. A woman with a blooming breast or large hips represents powerfully acquisition of maternal and paternal love. This let us understand how our body evolves and molds itself also in relation with how much attention and love we received. So, a thin body demonstrates the lack, and for that, as a consequence, a feeling of lacking power. I underline this concept just to let you understand how all this vision of fashion and aesthetic is deeply misrepresented. In contrast, we should take again these old principles that make us discover again a natural vision of the body. Also Leonardo da Vinci, Italian, with a draw called Canone delle Iscrizioni, through the representation of the Vitruvian man, in my opinion, expresses the will to define how man stands in the middle between heaven and earth. If we observe it better, we can see a man inscribed inside two big hemispheres, represented by circle and square. Man is so represented inside the way of heaven and earth, inside the five-pointed star. The interesting thing to observe is the ray of this center that ends on the navel. The center of this man, once again, is represented through the central zone of the body, union of the two polar forces. In common language, we say that we feel with the belly and not with the head. All our emotions are felt in the organs, in the heart, in the liver. The classic expression, eat your heart out, that underscore an expression of rage, let us perceive that we are something more than an intellectual aspect. We have inside us the center concept. To conclude this first part, let's underline that man has had the necessity to manifest externally what he feels internally. So recreate a center is as giving himself a center, and find out the center means giving himself a center. Since the beginning, man was looking for this center, and this inner theme had brought him to define the human talent as two. But center keeps also a power aspect. Besides that symbolic or psychological, we think, for example, to a table d'oili. If I put it in the center or by one side, I will notice the difference, because I will have an unbalanced feeling. We can say the same for a painting. If it is not well balanced in its color and weaves, we will feel something that does not work in respect of its center. Overall, in Japanese culture, this concept is very felt to recreate the feeling of the center creating stability, creating roots, generate the feeling of refined ourselves, because center is inside us too. This is the starting point, which we are going to develop in the Feng Shui studies, because it will be very important for research of the center of mass, which we will see in the next chapters. Let's delve into the center of mass theme, inside planning and architectonic realities. Remembering the previous speech as to say that center of mass is the center and represents the inner and external unity, it is the linking axis that links heaven and earth, called axis mundi in Roman symbols. This axis was expanded to the four cardinal directions, which in architectonic representation of temples, religious buildings, but also in the first installation, was represented through the four gates. A question: why these big buildings, like the pyramids or the big architectures of the past, were oriented to the four cardinal directions by the ancient ones? The reason is not so easy to understand, but I can give you some suggestions. Imagine, first of all, that magnetism could not be a simple electric-magnetic field, but a wall of flows. Let's associate for a moment magnetic laws with aerodynamic or thermodynamic laws. Then we could think that if we put a cube oriented to the four cardinal directions, we would have few flow turbulences in the corners. On the contrary, if we put it 45 degrees oriented respect to this flow, we would have more turbulences. Studies and researches in divining a non-scientific field has considered that if you orient objects in different ways, there are energetic differences. This theme, of course, is a study subject, but it is also interesting to observe that in most cases of ancient cultures, big buildings were always oriented in the four cardinal directions. That let it enter in resonance with a bigger system will acquire a bigger power. It's also true, as solar architecture teaches, that if we build a house in the four cardinal directions, this will bring a bigger acquirement and assimilation of the light and the heat inside the rooms. If we enter to the geobiologic knowledge, the study of the natural energies of a site, we will see that exist reticular fields that surround the whole Earth, overall to the north, south, east and west directions. Unifying these concepts together, we can think that if we put a building in a north-south direction, we put it in an oscillation resonance of bigger fields arranged in advance. Obviously, modern science finds it difficult to bring to light this knowledge with modern tools, but in my opinion, it's just a matter of time. I introduced this theme, which we can find in almost every ancient culture, just to understand, first of all, that the first step for every following analysis is to find the center of mass of a house. So let's start understanding better, inside the house, our principal subject, what center of mass means. You might have perceived that it is not a normal space, but has got its specific quality. So, as human body has a difference between its center of stability, the belly, and other parts, also the house, considered as living being, will get a difference between its center and the rooms. The center represents the heart of the house, considered as a seat that identifies the picture of all the aspects of the house. We could say that it's the spiritual center, the seat of Brahman in Vastu, of great power and unity, the Tai Chi in Feng Shui. It's the seat in which energy keeps on transforming itself and changing in relation with all the other spaces of the house. The center of mass is like a vortex that in some way synchronizes all the other linked rooms of the house. The center of mass expresses the house identity. Examples: if center of mass would be inside a space as the kitchen, the house would let this space predominate and consider that kitchen is a feminine space. The result will be, just for resonance, an accent and an activation of the feminine aspects between the inhabitants people. Therefore, it's possible that in that house offering, welcoming and feeding are preferable. Differently, if the house would have a center of mass in the living room, masculine theme would be better developed, for the reason that living room is linked more to the appearance in the exterior, and for resonance we will have an accent and an activation of the masculine aspects between the inhabitants. So it's possible that social life, career and representation would be stronger in that house. If the center of mass would be in corridor, so the powers will be distributed in a uniform way, we could say that in that house a familiar democracy would be more developed than a defined hierarchy. If, in contrary, center of mass would be in the parents' bedroom, a bigger parental authority would be stimulated. This conformation would bring also more responsibility and pressure toward the parents, because the bedroom, that would be a place to relax, would become the center of all familiar arguments. This theme would be worse if the center of mass would be in the children's bedroom, for the reason that could create an excess of responsibility and pressure over the children during the familiar management. It's better if the center of mass is not in the bathroom, for the reason that would be more difficult to contain the house energies, because the bathroom is a place of great replacement, also a theme replacement. We will see in a detailed way in the following courses the values and the best planning for every room. It would be better if center of mass were far away from the flues, because it would be disturbed by the fast rise of the power. Furthermore, we would have too much firepower, but we will talk about it later. The center of mass inside the house could have several thin nature effects, which could affect the psychological effects. And what does it mean if the center of mass is inside a load-bearing wall or in a pillar? We remember that the load-bearing wall got a static power that in this case is expressed in the center of mass. This will generate a blocked center of mass and means that the house heart is stopped. There's not fluidity in the house. Inside this house, between the rooms and the center of mass, there's not a replacement. Remember that in the classical level, in ancient China as in ancient India, center of mass was an area opened toward the sky, in which rain could fall, and the air was oxygenating all the rooms. Today we have to recall these ancient studies for the urban reality we live. This theme will be faced again more times to try to understand better how today exists a set of theories and interpretation that has to be valued through the ancient classical essential requirement. For this, if we have a center of mass inside a pillar or a wall, the house power will move slowly, and consequently inhabitants' people actions will be produced with effort. If center of mass is in a vacuum point or in a personal garden, but also in a neighbor flat, it means that there's not a house heart, it is gone to someone else. Who will live in this house will have more difficulties to create a family and contain it in an harmonic way. A center of mass positioned in stairs is not in an ideal position, because stairs have a power that move continuously up and down. So the center of mass will be influenced by the action of people who goes up and down continuously. It will be activated so in the long period, a continual movement in the heat of the house. The effect will be that the people of that house probably will travel a lot. They will be not much present. Also, if the center of mass is a geometric point, for this study will be considered the center of mass area, that is the central zone of the house. This is the first step to do for an analysis of holistic methodology for a site of a house. The search of a center of mass could be found through several ways. We will see in the next chapters, in a specific manner, how to find it and regulate it. In this chapter, we are going to talk about how to calculate the center of mass. Later, its graphic definition will be fundamental in order to install the so-called orientation star or 8-sector star in Feng Shui system. In fact, when the orientation star will be positioned, we must have had the center of mass yet, in order to translate the star, centering it in the center of mass, and then orienting it in the magnetic axis. But we will analyze this better in the following chapters that will be linked to the compass method. Now, rather for the form method, it will be enough simply to see where the center of mass of the house stands, and then do some interesting diagnosis and general analysis. So, coming to the point, how can the center of mass be calculated? In order to answer this question, it is very important being to comprehend that in an architectonic structure, a building or a flat, often spaces are not well squared, for the reason that there are some lacks of surpluses. Before talking about center of mass, we have to clarify this concept. Otherwise, it will be difficult to comprehend the following analysis. When can we say that a house has a lack of surplus? Let's look, for example, at this simplified draw. We can observe how general shape is principally due to the major area below. Let's draw the axis of this area. We can say that if the analyzed part stands inside this center line, then we will call it surplus. In contrary, if this part stands outside of the center line, as to say it is passing to the other side, we will call lack the remaining part, still in respect to the general structure. Therefore, in order to understand if we have got a lack or a surplus, we have to divide and break down the map in a geometric way and observe this concept of areas and weights. In ancient times, the concept of lack and surplus was not considered. Then these methods have been put into effect in function of different modern housing typologies, more and more complexes. A building map that leaning to squarey can be associated to a body which is well stabilized respect to its center, and for these energies flow in harmonious way inside. In reverse, an irregular structure with corners will create an irregular, non-homogeneous, non-fluid movement of the qi, which in Chinese language means thin power. This will create also an energetic unbalance inside such a kind of house. It's suggested for this to create regular shapes during the planning. In ancient times, this fact was always considered. In natural world exists a symmetry shape, even if this symmetry is not always perfect. A man's face, for example, is not symmetric in its two parts. If in nature existed a perfect symmetry, life itself would not exist. So, regular and equilibrated by nature shapes allow a continual energetic exchange. For this to create too many articulated shapes can generate both functional and planning usability problems and disharmonic resonances that enter in the inhabitant's weave. So we have to pay attention to not create a cacophonic musical space instead of an enharmonic one. Finally, we can say that lacks and surpluses in different levels create a kind of energetic destabilization in the space. During my static seismic studies, I realized that the structure of more irregular houses suffer larger damages and disasters. This is obvious for the reason that seismic energy, not founding a stability of shape, creates splits and breaches, especially in the weak points of the structure. It's interesting to put thin energy and static energy in comparison for the energetic containment theme. Subsequently, in the compass methods, we will see how lacks or surpluses create a defect of an excess of energy in the house that now always will be negatively valued. We will also see how it will be important to create harmonic relationship between various shapes and spaces of the house. And now let's define how to research the center of mass in an analytical way. First of all, it is necessary to clarify that there are different approaches to look for the center of mass. One of the main methods used in classic Feng Shui in ancient China was to initially frame the structure, then find the center of the sides, and from here draw the lines which meet the center. If we have got a structure with a surplus of little importance, this will be removed, and to find the center of mass, just the general structure will be analyzed. Anyway, if we have got more complex structures with important surpluses and lacks, this classic method is not so usable and accurate. This for the fact that it is necessary to remember that, in classic times, there was any particularly irregular architectonic compositions. But nowadays, due to modern requirement, we can find very complex houses. For this typology of cases comes in the aid of us another kind of method that we will call geometric. For example, if we have got a triangle, its center of mass is the match point of the diagonals, and this is simple. But if we have got a more complex structure, for example like this, center of mass will be inside of the line that unites the two centers of mass of the two squared parts. Let's see it better. First of all, it is necessary to frame the area in minor simple under areas. Draw the centers of mass of the under areas and then unite the centers of mass with a line. Inside of this house, surely there will be the point of center of mass. But where is the point of center of mass? We can perceive it always considering the concept of weights of the areas. In this case, since we have got the minor area around the quarter of the major area, obviously center of mass will be moved principally toward the major area, as to say the area that will most weight. Remember that center of mass is the point that keeps the structure in balance. So if I repeatedly cut out the structure made of card, and if I put a pencil under the center of mass, this should stay in balance. This geometric system is quite intuitive and fast, and can be useful to reason in a schematic and quick way during the search of the center of mass. If a sub-area we have got a triangle, remember that its center of mass derives from the meeting of the two medians. Once found this, we will unite it with the center of mass of another area, and then we will find the resultant center of mass of these two areas. Then we will unite this point with the center of mass of the third sub-area, and we will find the total center of mass. We can also use another method that we will call analytical mathematical. For example, we have got this complex structure that is necessary to subdivide in 3 sub-areas. Let's draw the diagonals in order to find their relative center of mass. Alongside of the structure, let's create an x-y axis and let's draw various x and y. The mathematical formula says that the resulting x of the total center of mass is area 1 multiplied by x1 plus area 2 by x2 plus area 3 by x3, and so on with many sub-areas. Divided by the sum of the areas, we can find the resulting y with area 1 multiplied by y1 plus area 2 by y2 plus area 3 by y3 divided by the sum of the areas. With this method, we can analytically find the comprehensive center of mass obtained by the meeting xy. Remember that xy axis could stand at any distance, provided that would stand fixed where is positioned. This last method is not gone down well by some master, because, being a very mathematical method, sometimes loses touch the organic wall of a housing shape. Sometimes it is necessary to observe the volumetric and three-dimensional wall of a house to well understand where the center of mass stands. As a matter of fact, there are cases where the house at first floor has got some accessions with doors that open to the external, like a tool room or a garage, that there aren't at second floor. In this case, it is not considered. Vice versa, it could be a lacking part at low ground that is filled in the upper floors. In this case, we could consider this lacking part as full. Summarizing it, for the search of center of mass, it is important to know all these methods and using them in specific cases in order to obtain different checks. It is necessary to take into account that in simple cases the first method is surely good, but in very complex cases the second and the third methods helps to understand if the first is correct. Finally, we have understood the meaning of the center of mass and we know the method to find it. At this point we can do the first analysis, observing if it is blocked or too moved away and in which room stands. Besides, remember that center of mass will be fundamental to install the analysis star in the several magnetic bands, for the reason that the star will be positioned in the middle of center of mass and then oriented to north. But we will see these in detail later in the next chapters using the compass method. When we talk about the structure that has to be outlined in order to search the area in which we define the center of mass, it is necessary to remember that the structure used is all the net floor area, as to say defined by the heated walls. Balconies, external areas, apartment building stairs, verandas and external accessions that as external doors, like a garage, are not considered. The perimeter for the structure analysis can be calculated inside the wall perimeter, the most used method, or external to the wall perimeter. Let's analyze the chapter of correctives. Correctives are useful at the moment we face cases where center of mass is not harmonic, as to say that stands inside a pillar, inside a wall, or outside a house. In classical knowledge, there aren't theories about the corrective of center of mass. Now I will show you the following interpretation and experiences in their evolution, derived from problems of modern housing typologies. So let's consider that when center of mass is blocked, it creates a block that stays in the house. The theme remains but we can try in some way to correct it or reduce its effect. To understand this, I will show you one of my travels to Auroville, India, near Pondicherry in the south of Madras. Auroville is an ideal and experimental little town full of research laboratories. It was founded in 1968 based on Sri Aurobindo and Mir inspiration. Here have been developed several laboratories and research experimentations linked to the systems of alternative building. When I first arrived there, I felt that all the principles and studies that I had learned had been revisited and used in the housing theme too. Indeed, in the middle of this little town, we find a very interesting structure, a geoid called Matrimandir. This structure, watched in a mirror vision, had to be in the center of Auroville, that, urban speaking, was standardized like a kind of universe rotating on itself. Every building had to have got a modular structure changing during time, in an underneath plant design system, like a continually changing universe. The Matrimandir recovers the ancient Roman principle of axis mundi, as to say, the structure that unifies the energies of heaven and earth, in order to make them flow in the four cardinal directions that divide the town in four areas: industrial, housing, and so on. The Matrimandir in the middle represents the soul of the town. Observing this cross-section, we notice that inside this space there are two opposite coils of light that symbolically remember DNA. At the end of the flight, we arrive in this area of meditation and prayer, a very interesting and energetically charged place in which there are 12 columns down holding nothing per se. Again comes back the column theme, and number 12 linked to the energetic cycles of time. In my opinion, these columns are a kind of oscillator that creates a bigger resonance of internal theme energies. The structure was built in reinforced concrete for static and functional reasons, although was thought differently by Mir. Externally we find these discs that had to be mobile. Maybe Mir was thinking of a kind of solar panels. Now let's observe the center of the Matrimandir. Here we find a big crystal ball of about 70 centimeters, built in Switzerland and leaning on a basement marked by Aurobindo symbol, which is leaning in turn on a flower with 12 petals, the symbol of Mir. Again we find the opposition among the two synthesis forces of unity. The sphere is continually lightened by a mirror positioned on the top, moving itself with the sun movement, continually bringing the light hit the sphere. The light crosses the sphere and, passing by a hole, reaches the basement where we find a water basin containing this power. Studying and analyzing this structure, I understood that at the base of it exists the will to continually create some clean and thin power, preserved by the polarities. It's well known that crystals have the power to absorb and expand thin kinds of energy. It's enough to study and experiment some kind of cure through the 1,000-year Tibetan culture crystals. This energetic axis contained by the sphere that unifies sky powers through the light and earth powers through the water creates a kind of double canal that stabilizes and expands the Auroville powers. So we find again the axis mundi theme, but developed here in a modern key. In a planning case in which the plant was out of axis and center of mass external of the house, I've been obliged to experiment and try to activate a new center of mass. In a space next to the old center of mass, inside a range of about 1.5 meters and not beyond, I recreated a new center of mass. I positioned a lamp on the ground, then I put a different spotlight on the ceiling. I built a basement with the 5 elements that I oriented, and finally I leaned a quite big crystal ball made of stone. the crystal ball is lightened precisely through the light in both parts, and this created a new virtual power axis. After a while, backing to visit this house, I realized how this axis has been reinforced in the moment that also the customer understood it and activated it through its continuous reaction, improving the harmony inside the space. In my opinion, these activations can improve the theme of a static and fixed center of mass. If I have the problem of a lacking or blocked center of mass, another problem I verified is to try increasing center of mass in every space, creating a balance in several rooms of the house through some squares in the floor or on the ceiling. Creating an energetic containment in the spaces obtained by squares on the floor or on the ceiling, or with centered furnishing compositions, it's possible to provide for lack of well-working center, so other center of mass that resonates and compensates the disequilibrium are created. Its value can be furthermore increased through the light centered in the space. If I have a center of mass in the wall, it's possible to create a niche in the axis of the center of mass, bringing it out and lightening it. On the wall at issue, it's also possible to put a lightened picture that lies at the heart of the inhabitants of the house. If stands in a living room, I can activate it better, positioning a significant lamp in the zone of the center of mass. Remember that the center of mass, if free, doesn't need nothing more than itself. However, if we want to activate it, you shouldn't put a column-shaped aquarium with fishes, for example, because this would block its flow. Center of mass has to be free, so it's good position overall under the light or some significant elements. This is another example of a center of mass I activated. There's a tile on the floor and a light on the ceiling with a little picture that creates a point of an axis. Also this one, a creation of mine, again an activation formed by a particular false ceiling with a circle form, heaven, with a light that hits a square stone on the floor, earth. However, remember that everybody has his fantasy and creativity to experiment the activation of a center of mass that has to be as in harmony as possible with the personality of the customer. Nevertheless, remember to respect the principle which has a specific modality and motivation. Inside all these theories, it's always advisable to understand and relive the principle, using it subsequently inside your own cultural field, given by a specific signs and languages.